Let's start with the beginnings. You went to Harvard and with your identical twin brother. Tell us about kind of that experience at Harvard and what was so special about it and how it helped you gear toward entrepreneurship.
Well, really, actually, if you're talking about what geared me towards entrepreneurship, I'd say the beginnings for me was much earlier. When I was 9 years old, my dad gave us a computer. This is when we still lived in Iran, and probably I would guess that Hadi and I were the only children in Iran with a computer. This is, back in 1980 or something. And learning to program by ourselves was, I'd say, for sure the seed for us to grow up to become entrepreneurs. And I think it's because computer programming is inherently a very creative process. And it gives you this excitement about being able to create whatever you can imagine. I never thought of it as having any business side. I just thought of it as fun, and I would make games for myself or my brother to play on the computer. But then being at Harvard, I, for the first time, even thought of the idea of starting a business and running your own business. And in my case, that's something that I was introduced to as part of a formal Harvard program called Harvard Student Agencies, HSA. Basically encourages students to start their own company or to run or to inherit one from a prior student. And a friend of mine who had started his own recruited me to basically take it over when he graduated. And so in basically my last year in college, I was running my own business, and I knew that this is what I wanted to do for sure after I graduate. And my whole life I'd actually thought I would become a doctor, and basically in my last year.
A lot of people did.
Yeah, in my last year at Harvard, I decided I really wanted to start my own company instead and stay focused in the computer business.
Well, that's good. Well, unlike many others, you actually finished your bachelor's and also finished your master's, so you wanted to finish your education. So going back to family, it seems like your father was one of the co-founders of Sharif University. Was he, a source of inspiration, and how was he a source of inspiration for you and Hadi growing up?
He was, although I have to confess, I didn't realize until fairly recently that my dad had helped start Sharif University. First of all, when he was doing it, it was called Aryamer, and I was so young at the time. I just remember that my dad was always away from home working, and even when he was home, he was always working. I didn't really know what he was, I knew he was a professor and that he actually was involved with several universities' physics departments. But it wasn't until fairly recently that I realized that one of these universities that my dad started was now considered one of the top universities in the world, and certainly was very proud to learn that long after the fact. But the influence really for me was, for one, my dad being a nuclear physicist, I always just, like most children, wanted to grow up to be like my dad, and so I loved math and science, and in particular physics, growing up. And actually, when I got to university, it was like a tug of war between wanting to become a doctor versus studying physics versus what I really loved, which was computer science. And ultimately, computer science won, but it was definitely, it was only literally in my senior year that I decided to major in computer science. Yeah, but it's thanks to my dad that I started programming at a young age, and also that I just had such a strong emphasis on academics. And I guess in hindsight, he was somewhat of an entrepreneur as well, but in the academic world. But that's not something that I really connected until looking back later. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your identical twin brother, Hadi. So you guys have gone to school together, done a lot of businesses together, and now he lives in Seattle. How has the relationship maybe transformed over time? Is there any kind of sense of competition? How are you guys growing up and now?
Well, these things changed, but when we were in, basically when we were teenagers, we really didn't like the fact that everyone confused us with each other. And so we really didn't want to go to college together. We wanted to each go somewhere and be independent and have our own identity. Because throughout a lot of high school, people literally just talked about us as a pair and didn't bother even knowing which was which. No, it's true. And then it was a struggle deciding where to go to college because we both wanted to go to Harvard and neither of us wanted to go, to settle for something different. So we ended up going to the same college, but trying to be in opposite ends of the campus, and we wouldn't tell each other what courses we were going to take so that we would end up in separate classes. Unfortunately, we ended up in almost all the same classes. And as a result, we had all the same, friends in our study groups. So by our sophomore year in college, we realized, we can't fight the fact that we're so similar and we have all the same passions, so we might as well embrace it and take advantage of it.
And what are some of those other passions? I know music and rock climbing, and it's just not academic.
Yeah, we both, certainly computer programming and computer science. I guess everything I just said about myself would have been true for him. But yeah, we also both love music very much, and we've both played piano since we were young, and guitar as well. So, in fact, after I sold my first company, I tried to start a band. Fortunately, gave that up after not too long. But yeah, so we've remained, Hadi and I've remained very close. After we graduated, we also really helped each other, ironically financially, because neither of us, our family left everything behind to come from Iran to America, and we both felt some obligation to take care of our parents once we grow up. And so when my brother and I were both working after college, I felt like he stayed in a stable job while I started a startup, and I felt like he provided the stability that if my thing fails, at least he will maybe take care of me, or at least take care of our parents. And then after Microsoft acquired my startup, literally, within a year, he left to start his own startup, and so we each provided each other sort of a safety net. We also have pooled our earnings together, so we've also more explicitly sort of diversified by betting on each other, I guess, and investing together as well after that.
So when you make investments together, you both have to say yes, or how does that work?
Yeah, so basically, we try to make investments together. Once in a while, I'll invest in something that is just more of a personal passion and he's not interested in. But in general, the rule of thumb is that if I can't even convince my own identical twin brother that it's a good idea, then it's probably not a good idea. And vice versa. So yeah, so it helps keep you honest to have somebody else to convince, because with investing, it's different. Investing is a lot like falling in love, where you see something, you get excited, and you think it's flawless and perfect. And I think it's actually a human weakness that you don't see the flaws in something if you want it to be perfect. And it helps to have a second person look at it and say, these are all the problems, and and try to figure out, is it really great, or is it are you fooling yourself? So yeah, so having each other to bounce ideas off of is very helpful for that reason.
So from there, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what you guys have started and both are involved in Code.org, which is a fascinating 501c3 nationwide organization with a lot of recognition of trying to implement coding in public school education. And I guess what has been some of the challenges from that growth that you foresee, and where do you see the vision of that going?
Yeah, well, Code.org, it's been by far the most successful and inspiring thing I've ever been involved in. And the credit really is far more to my brother Hadi. We started it together and we co-funded it, but he's now doing it full time. 100% of his time is focused on that, and I'm just getting to enjoy the benefits of being associated with it. but it's perhaps better known for the Hour of Code, which is our annual event, and it's the Hour of Code is a week each year in December. The third one is coming up next month, and in terms of challenges, I'd say the only I don't think I've ever been involved with anything where nothing has gone wrong. Everything Code.org has done has been has exceeded our expectations. So the initial idea for Code.org was just to have a viral video to promote computer science, and we hoped that we would have 5 million views. And we had 5 million views in the first day, and so we crushed our expectations. And I think the video peaked out at 13 or 15 million views. And then we were, for a long time, we were sort of depressed because we didn't know what we could do to top that. And then Hadi came up with the idea of the Hour of Code and the idea of getting students and schools to do 1 hour of computer programming as a way to expose kids to computer science. And we said, we'll try to have 10 million kids do this. And our board members all said, this is crazy. You know, just because a video went viral, 5-minute video is much easier to go viral than 1 hour of computer science education. But when we did launch the Hour of Code, it had 20 million people do it in its first week. And now, almost 2 years later, 130 million people have done it. 1 out of 2 children in America has done the Hour of Code, which is pretty phenomenal. If anything, I'd say the only failure or challenge has been we haven't done a good enough job telling the world the story of how much impact it's had, in part because it's so much, and it's hard for people to believe that an organization that's not even 3 years old yet has had this much impact. We've got more than 100,000 classrooms are now teaching standard computer science curriculum that we created off of our website. As I mentioned, 130 million kids have done the Hour of Code, which puts us amongst the fastest growing websites in history. Certainly, when Hour of Code launched, I would say reaching 20 million people in the first week probably is the fastest growing website in history. And we have partnerships with 70 school districts around America. We've trained 10,000 teachers already, and we're currently training 15,000 teachers to teach computer science in their schools. So we have teacher training centers all around the country now. And so it's been incredibly gratifying. And it's entirely, should repeat, credit to my brother, because a lot of this is easy to talk about, but the execution of hiring the staff to create the create the curriculum and to set up all these teacher training centers is a lot of work.
Well, that's good. It seems like you definitely dedicate a lot of time toward philanthropy. How much of your time do you really, is it really philanthropy? And also, you also are very passionate about food and agriculture and better food for public schools, like you said, enhancing public school education through education and code.org. What else do you envision that you'd like to see being enhanced in education today in public schools nationwide as well?
Well, for one, I generally don't like the word philanthropy, even though I guess it is accurate, because philanthropy implies, philanthropy and charity to me feel more like, what it is, I think, is the adage about instead of giving a man a fish, teach a man to fish. And, for me, the idea of simply giving something away is not as attractive as enabling somebody to empower themselves or to earn something for themselves. And what motivates me more, rather than talking about philanthropy, I talk about impact, and I care about impact. And impact is something that you can have in a for-profit or nonprofit organization. And I actually would say that most of my for-profit efforts, I would say, are also motivated by impact. So I think of Dropbox, for example, even though it's a pure tech for-profit company, it has really changed the way people think about the peace of mind of their files being safe and not having to worry about losing them. Or Uber has had an enormous impact. It has created employment for millions of people on the driver's side, and it has really changed the way we transport ourselves. So those are obviously not philanthropic. but on the nonprofit side, education is where I've done almost all my focus, and that's because I think of education as the most leveraged way to impact people, not just by, not just via a handout, but by empowering and enabling people to then lift themselves up. And Code.org is the biggest effort in the education realm, but you alluded to food, and that's another area where I've been involved in. I'm on the board of a nonprofit called Food Corps that's very similar to Teach for America, but focused on food. So it sends young volunteers or service workers into schools around the country to improve the cafeteria, plant school gardens, and to teach kids more about where food comes from, and generally tries to focus on disadvantaged communities where oftentimes these kids' primary source of calories is from the school lunch, and their exposure to food is so different from what many of us might take for granted. They've never cracked an egg in their life, and they've never seen a plant or vegetable grow in a garden before. Their idea of where food comes from is from McDonald's. And so exposing kids to just things that, for me, or for a lot of us, I think, take for granted, it really helps give kids a sense of connection to food that is important to education. If nothing else, simply having kids be better fed helps them learn more, and is one of the big determinants of both attendance and awareness in the classroom. Having said that, Code.org's impact has been an order of magnitude bigger and faster, so it's very hard to top that with any other philanthropic effort at all.
We saw the article from Warren Buffett, was it, that he likes unhealthy food, and you were talking about healthy food. Do you like to comment on that article?
Yeah, well, Warren Buffett, obviously he's a legend, and in almost every other sphere, I would say I would bow down and have a lot to learn from him. But this is one where I'm not sure what he's thinking, frankly, because clearly the consumer trend in the United States is a trend towards conscientious eating, and every traditional food brand is suffering right now. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, General Mills, all of the major food companies, McDonald's, are significantly down in terms of their financial success because of the massive consumer trend towards more conscientious eating. And so in that context, he was essentially, he recently engineered a merger between two of these large food brands, and to me that seems really kind of on the wrong side of history. I think where the opportunity is in the much more younger food companies that are focused on tapping into people's desire to. People want to have their the way they eat match their values in some way or another, whether it's caring for the environment or health or so on. And very few traditional food brands have that. It's all the younger, newer brands that have grown up in the last decade or two.
I wanted to briefly go back to Link Exchange, which made a huge success and was sold to Microsoft in the 90s, I believe. And I think that's when you were also involved with Tony Hsieh, and then later invested in Zappos, and you're still, I think, co-investing with Tony Hsieh. And so based on that, how important was network, and how did you guys find each other? And
well, Tony and I, we were co-founders of Link Exchange, although technically he and another guy started it, and then I joined as the third partner after a few months. But we knew each other at Harvard, so Tony and Sanjay, the other guy, were also in the computer science department at Harvard. I graduated in '94, and they graduated in '95. And I think because I was a twin brother, I was a very visible person. Two twins who were in this computer science department. The whole department was like 30 people or 35 people, so everyone knew who the two twins were. And so when Tony and Sanjay were looking for a third partner, they actually asked my brother to join them, and he said, well, I'm doing really well in my job right now. You should ask Ali. And so essentially they settled for me because they wanted Hadi. But almost no one remembers what Link Exchange was today, because most of what we did was in some ways a predecessor to things that are much more effective today. So the core of what Link Exchange did was to help small businesses advertise on the web. And it may not, you have to kind of go back to the mid-90s to kind of put it in context. We were acquired by Microsoft long before Google was even founded. And a lot of the ideas of what we hope to accomplish and help small businesses with were predecessors to things like AdWords. I remember when we were trying to raise financing, telling the VCs that what we did was enable small businesses to get more traffic to their websites. And more than one VC would say, why would the small business want that? And we're like, okay, you're not going to get this. But really at the time, the mindset for a lot of investors was to invest in infrastructure for how to make your server more scalable without thinking about the fact that most small businesses didn't have much traffic. The last thing they cared about was being more scalable. They first wanted to get the traffic. And there were no services catering to small businesses at all. So that's what Link Exchange did. And by the end of, it was 2.5 years of working hard together before we were acquired. I got to know Tony really well, and he left shortly after the acquisition and started a new VC fund, and I invested in the fund, and then the fund spawned Zappos, and then Tony said this is the winner, and he actually decided to become the CEO of Zappos rather than continuing the fund. And so then I invested more in Zappos. I was really following Tony, I guess. And I guess I would say that the broader experience for me is the most important thing one can do, I think, to ensure success is to follow good people and to surround oneself with good people. And in the case of Tony Hsieh, I already knew both his strengths and his weaknesses, and was very willing to bet on him for Zappos. But more broadly, there's a lot of other really strong people from my first company that I've tried to follow into whatever they've done next. So Max Levchin, for example, the founder of PayPal, was a 19-year-old contractor at Link Exchange. And Scott Bannister was a young guy at Link Exchange as well. And Bannister is not quite as famous, but is an incredibly successful guy. He started a company called Ironport that was a billion-dollar acquisition by Cisco, and he's been, I'd say he's one of the top angel investors in Silicon Valley by far, on the ground floor of lots of very successful companies.
And I wanted to get your opinion based on your success with Link Exchange and various other companies. The tech boom, you lived through the tech boom in the 90s, and now it's starting to look a little different. So what's your opinion about some of the differences with how the tech industry is shaping now? Where do you see it going in the next 6 to 9 months, and how does that compare to the 90s?
Yeah, I guess this is certainly the fashionable question these days of are we in a bubble or not. I think that while there are some concerning things about the state of things today, it's not nearly what it was like in the late 90s. In the late 90s, there was really a sense of people starting companies and even going public without any sort of business model, and it really felt like some sort of a pyramid scheme. Like it really felt like people were intentionally creating things, knowing that there was no real deep merit to it, and they were just trying to go public as quickly as they can and get rich before it fell apart. And in contrast to that, I think that companies today generally are at least motivated by having a real business and having a focus on creating value. And there are a lot of them that are creating enormous real value. So you could say that valuations might be inflated, or that some of them I think there's always cases that are not as strong as others, but I wouldn't say that it's a systemic case. The other thing that was very typical of the late 90s was that a lot of these startups in the late 90s were inflating each other. So, some startup was selling advertising, and 80% of its revenues was from other venture-backed startups that were buying advertising, and those other guys were also making money from selling advertising to other venture-backed startups. And so the whole ecosystem was was reliant on itself in a dangerous way. And in some cases, they weren't even real money. It was just barter, but being counted as if it's revenue. And so once it began to fall, the whole thing kind of spiraled downwards. In contrast, today, I think there's a lot more of consumers paying for services. Uber is fueled by consumer payment. Dropbox is fueled by consumer payment. So Dropbox is not reliant on VCs funding other startups to keep Dropbox alive, or Uber, obviously. Facebook, likewise, the ad-supported businesses are not selling ads to Silicon Valley startups generally. There's an enormous amount of mainstream advertising money being spent on the internet. So I think the core business environment is much, much stronger than it was then. And it's just because the penetration of the internet and of smartphones is, it's a much bigger space than it was 15 years ago.
And last question, real quick, just because there's such a tremendous audience here. If you could give one advice, just one advice to all these entrepreneurs and inspiring entrepreneurs, what would that be?
Well, when my twin brother was starting his first company, I had just sold my company to Microsoft. He asked me to give him 3 pieces of advice. He said, "What are the top 3 things you would advise me to do if I'm starting my first startup?" And I said, number 1, hire great people. Number 2, hire great people. And number 3, hire great people. And it was sort of a joke, but it was real. I could look back at my own success and see everything that had gone well was not because of some smart decision of mine, but it was because of some talented person that we had put in the right place, and it was them doing something great. And everything that had gone wrong was due to somebody that we should have fired, that we didn't have the strength, I guess, to fire. And certainly in my own career, this story is now, I guess, almost 17 years old when I gave my brother that advice. But ever since then, everything else that I've done has also, I would say, has been motivated by this, in that all of my successful investments are investments that I made because of the people. So Zappos and Tony Hsieh, case in point, and some of the other people I mentioned earlier. Dropbox, same thing. We were, when we were deciding to invest in Dropbox, we strongly believed that cloud storage was going to be a major opportunity, but Dropbox was not the only company with the idea. In fact, they weren't even the first. There were many, many other companies with different type of virtual storage, virtual file system ideas, and we interviewed many of those companies, and we chose Drew and Arash in large part based on putting them through rigorous technical interview and checking how good of a coder each of them was, and invested based largely on that.